The day had been long, and the walking had been steady and slow, through paths that wound beneath tall trees, whose branches met overhead like the ceiling of a quiet room. The forest was not dark, but dim in the way that forests are when the sun begins to lower itself toward the horizon, casting everything in a soft and even light that makes it hard to tell 1 hour from the next. The traveler moved without hurry, placing one foot before the other, noticing the way the path felt beneath warm shoes, the way the air smelled of bark and moss, and the faint sweetness of pine needles warmed by the afternoon sun. The walking itself had become a kind of rhythm, not something the traveler thought about, but something the body simply did, one step following another in an endless pattern that required no effort and no attention. The path was uneven in places, rising and falling gently, winding around the largest trees and through small clearings where the light fell in scattered patches on the ground. The traveler noticed these things without remarking on them, without giving them names or assigning them meaning, simply letting them pass through awareness the way clouds pass through the sky. There had been no beginning to this walk that the traveler could remember clearly, no moment when they had decided to enter the forest or follow this particular path. It was as if the walking had always been happening, as if the forest had always been around them, and the thought of where they had come from or where they might be going seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was only the present moment, the feeling of ground beneath feet, the sound of leaves rustling overhead, the way the light shifted and changed as the afternoon wore on. The traveler's thoughts were slow and scattered, drifting like leaves on the surface of still water. They thought of nothing in particular, no worries or plans or memories that demanded attention, only the vague awareness of being here, in this place, moving through this quiet forest as the day slowly turned toward evening. There was a peacefulness in this emptiness of thought, a sense of being unmoored from the usual concerns that filled the hours, and the traveler did not resist it, but let themselves sink into it the way one sinks into warm water. There had been no particular reason for the walk, no destination that called with urgency or purpose. It was simply the kind of day when movement felt right, when staying still seemed less natural than following a trail deeper into the woods, where the sounds of the world grew softer and more distant. Birds called now and then from the branches above, not with alarm or excitement, but with the slow, measured songs that birds sing when they are simply passing the time. The traveler listened to them without trying to identify their voices, letting the sounds become part of the rhythm of walking, part of the quiet that filled the spaces between thoughts. The forest seemed to breathe around them, a slow and steady breathing that had nothing to do with wind or weather, but was simply the way the forest existed, drawing in light and letting it filter through the leaves, drawing in silence, and releasing it again in soft whispers. The traveler felt this breathing without understanding it, felt the way their own breath began to match its pace, slow and deep and unhurried. There was no need to think about breathing, no need to count or measure. The body simply knew what to do, and the traveler trusted it completely. Occasionally, the path would open into a wider space where the trees drew back and the sky became visible overhead, still bright with the late afternoon sun, but beginning to show the first hints of deeper color at the edges, a pale gold fading toward amber. The traveler would pause in these spaces, not because they needed to rest, but because the openness seemed to invite pausing, seemed to suggest that this was a place for standing still and looking up and noticing the way the light fell through the branches in long, slanting beams. In these moments of stillness, the traveler could hear other sounds beneath the bird song, the faint rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, the creak of branches settling into new positions, the distant sound of water moving somewhere far off, so faint it might have been imagined. These sounds were not distinct or separate, but wove together into a kind of fabric, soft and continuous, that wrapped around the traveler like a blanket. After a time, the traveler would begin walking again, leaving the open spaces behind and returning to the narrower path where the trees grew close and the light was dimmer. The transition felt natural, requiring no decision or effort, simply the continuation of movement that had been happening all along. The traveler's feet found their way without guidance, stepping over roots and around stones, following the path as it curved and wound deeper into the forest. The light continued to change, growing softer and more golden, and the traveler noticed this in the way one notices a room growing dimmer as evening comes on, not all at once but gradually, so that it is only after some time has passed that the change becomes clear. The trees seemed to lean closer together, their trunks thick and steady, their roots rising and falling across the path like slow waves. The traveler stepped over them carefully, not hurrying, not worried about stumbling, only moving with the kind of attention that comes naturally when the body is tired and the mind has begun to drift. The bark of the trees was rough and deeply textured, marked with lines and patterns that suggested great age, years and years of growth and seasons passing. The traveler reached out once or twice to touch the bark, feeling its roughness against their palm, the way it held the warmth of the day, even as the air around them began to cool. There was something comforting in the solidness of the trees, in their silence and their stillness, in the way they stood without needing anything, without asking for attention or acknowledgment. The ground beneath the traveler's feet was covered in a thick layer of fallen needles and leaves, soft and slightly springy, muffling the sound of footsteps, so that the traveler seemed to move through the forest almost silently, like a shadow or a thought. This softness made the walking easier, required less effort, and the traveler felt their body relaxing further with each step, the muscles in their legs and back loosening, the tightness in their shoulders gradually releasing. As the light continued to fade, the colors of the forest changed as well, the greens growing deeper and more muted, the browns and grays becoming more pronounced. The traveler noticed these shifts without analyzing them, simply letting their eyes take in the changing landscape, the way the forest seemed to settle into itself as the day drew toward its close. There was a sense of the forest preparing for night, not in any active or deliberate way, but in the natural rhythm of things, the way flowers close at dusk and nocturnal creatures begin to stir. The air grew cooler, not cold but pleasantly cool, carrying with it the scent of earth and water and growing things. The traveler breathed deeply, filling their lungs with this cool air, feeling it clear their head and calm their thoughts even further. There was nowhere to be, nothing to do, only this walking through the forest as the day slowly ended, and the traveler felt a deep sense of rightness in this simplicity, in the absence of complication or demand. There was no sound of rushing water, no wind strong enough to bend the branches, only the soft rustling of leaves high above, and the occasional creak of wood settling into itself. The forest felt still, not in the way of something holding its breath, but in the way of something deeply at rest. The traveler moved through this stillness as if through water, each step slow and deliberate, each breath deep and even. There was no sense of being watched, no feeling of danger or uncertainty, only the quiet awareness of being alone in a place that was itself alone, far from roads and voices and the hum of distant machines. The traveler's weariness had been growing gradually throughout the day, so slowly that it was hard to say when it had begun. Perhaps it had been there from the start, a heaviness in the limbs that made each step require just slightly more effort than it should. Or perhaps it had accumulated over the hours, building with each mile walked, each hill climbed, each moment spent moving forward without rest. Whatever its origin, the weariness was undeniable now, a weight that pressed down on the traveler's shoulders and made their legs feel thick and slow. But it was not an unpleasant weariness. There was no pain in it, no discomfort that demanded immediate attention. It was simply the body's quiet insistence that rest was needed, that the time for walking was drawing to a close, and the time for stillness was approaching. The traveler felt this insistence without resisting it, accepting it as naturally as they had accepted the walking itself, knowing that when the right place for rest appeared they would recognize it and stop. The shadows beneath the trees had grown longer and darker, pooling in the low places and spreading across the path. The traveler moved through these shadows without fear, their eyes adjusting easily to the dimness, their feet still finding their way without stumbling. The darkness was not absolute, not the deep black of night, but the softer darkness of late evening, when shapes are still visible but details become unclear, when the world takes on a dreamlike quality that is neither fully real nor fully imagined. Somewhere ahead the traveler sensed a change in the forest, a subtle shift in the quality of the light or the density of the trees. They could not have said what alerted them to this change, could not have pointed to any specific sign or signal, but the awareness was there nonetheless, a feeling that something different lay ahead, that the path was leading toward a destination, even though no destination had been sought. After a time the path began to widen, and the trees drew back just enough to reveal a small clearing ahead. The traveler paused at the edge of this clearing, not from caution, but simply to look, to take in the sight of what lay before them. In the center of the clearing stood a cottage, small and sturdy, built of dark wood that had weathered many seasons. Its roof was steep and covered in moss, and its windows were narrow and set deep into the walls, reflecting the last light of the day in a way that made them seem warm and inviting. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, lazy line, drifting upward and dissolving into the air above the trees. The clearing itself was peaceful, carpeted with grass that had been allowed to grow long and soft, dotted here and there with small wildflowers that nodded gently in the faint breeze. The cottage sat at the center of this clearing, as if it had grown there naturally, as if it were as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves. There was no fence around it, no garden or cultivated space, only the wild grass and the flowers, and the cottage standing quiet and still in the fading light. The traveler stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, simply looking, simply being present with the sight of the cottage and the peaceful space around it. There was no hurry to move forward, no urgency to enter or explore. The travelers simply stood and looked and felt the weariness in their body grow heavier, felt the pull of rest become stronger. The cottage seemed to offer something, not in words or gestures, but in its very presence, in the way it stood solid and welcoming in the twilight, in the way the windows glowed softly, and the smoke rose gently from the chimney. The grass whispered as the traveler stepped into the clearing, each footstep sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air here was different from the air in the forest, slightly warmer, slightly more open, as if the clearing held on to the day's warmth even as the forest around it began to cool. The traveler moved slowly across the clearing, their eyes fixed on the cottage, noticing the details as they drew closer, the way the wood of the walls had darkened with age, the way the door sat slightly ajar, the way the windows seemed to watch without watching, simply present and patient. The traveler stood for a moment, watching the cottage, feeling the weight of the walk in their legs and the quiet pull of rest in their chest. There was no question of whether to approach, no moment of decision or hesitation. It was simply that the cottage was there, and the traveler was tired, and the door stood slightly open, as if in welcome. The traveler moved forward across the clearing, their steps making no sound on the soft earth, and as they drew closer, they noticed the way the windows glowed faintly from within, as if a fire had been burning there not long ago, and still gave off a gentle warmth. The porch, if it could be called that, was just a single wide step leading up to the door, worn smooth by time and use. The travelers stepped up onto it, feeling the solid wood beneath their feet, and paused for just a moment before reaching out to push the door open. The wood was cool to the touch, smooth and slightly damp from the evening air, and when the traveler pushed gently, the door swung inward with only the softest creak, a sound so quiet it might have been the house itself sighing. The threshold crossed itself, the traveler stepping from the outside world into the interior of the cottage without ceremony or announcement. The change was immediate but subtle, the cooler air of the evening giving way to the warmer air of the house, the open sounds of the forest fading into the enclosed quiet of the rooms. The traveler stood just inside the door for a moment, letting their eyes adjust to the dimness, letting their body feel the difference between outside and inside, between movement and the promise of stillness. The door was wooden and worn smooth by time and touch, and it swung inward with only the faintest creak when the traveler pushed it gently with one hand. Inside, the cottage was dim and warm, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something faint and comforting like bread baked hours before or herbs dried and hung from the rafters. The traveler stepped inside and closed the door softly behind them, not latching it, only drawing it shut enough to keep out the cooler air of the evening. The main room of the cottage was small and simply arranged, every object seeming to have its place, every space used with care and intention. The walls were made of the same dark wood as the exterior, unadorned except for a few pegs near the door where coats or bags might hang. The floor was made of wide wooden planks, worn smooth in the centers where feet had walked most often, showing the grain of the wood in patterns that suggested years of use. The travelers' feet made no sound on these floors as they moved further into the room, their eyes taking in the details slowly, without hurry. To one side a hearth held the remains of a fire, the coals still glowing faintly beneath a layer of ash, giving off just enough light to see by and just enough warmth to keep the chill from the air. The hearth was made of stone, dark gray and smooth. with a wide opening that suggested many fires had burned there over many years. Above the hearth, a wooden mantel held a few simple objects: a candlestick, a small carved figure, things that had been placed there not for decoration, but because they belonged there, because that was where they lived. Before the hearth stood 3 chairs, each one different from the others. The first was large and heavy, built of thick wood, with a high back and wide arms, the kind of chair that suggested weight and permanence. That seemed to have been made for someone much larger than the traveler. The second was smaller, less imposing, with a curved back and legs that tapered toward the floor, a chair that suggested comfort, but in a different way, softer perhaps, more yielding. The third was smallest of all, low to the ground and narrow, with straight legs and a simple back, as if made for someone much smaller than the traveler, a child perhaps, or someone who preferred to sit close to the floor. The traveler stood in the center of the room, looking at the chairs, noticing the way they were arranged in a loose semicircle around the hearth, as if waiting for people to come and sit and warm themselves by the fire. The chairs were empty now, had perhaps been empty for some time, but there was something welcoming about them nonetheless, something that suggested they were used to being sat in, that they expected to be sat in again. The traveler stood for a moment in the center of the room, looking at the chairs, then at the table that stood nearby. The table was simple and solid, made of the same dark wood as everything else in the cottage, its surface marked with small scratches and dents that told of years of use. It stood against one wall, positioned so that someone sitting at it could look out through one of the narrow windows toward the clearing beyond. On the table were 3 bowls, also different from one another, arranged in a neat row as if someone had set them out with care and intention. The first bowl was large and deep, wide enough to hold a generous portion of whatever had been placed in it, made of thick pottery that looked heavy and substantial. The second was medium in size, neither as large as the first nor as small as the third, its shape more delicate, its walls thinner. The third was small and shallow, just the right size for a small portion, its rim decorated with a simple pattern that had been worn almost smooth by handling. The traveler could see that each bowl had held something, perhaps porridge or soup, something thick and warm that had been poured or ladled into the bowls and then left to cool. Whatever it was had grown cold, and still by now, the surface no longer steaming, the contents settled and quiet. The traveler felt no inclination to disturb them, no hunger that demanded attention. It was not food that had brought them here, but weariness, and the sight of the bowls and the chairs and the dying fire only made that weariness feel heavier, more undeniable. The light in the room was growing dimmer as the last of the daylight faded from the windows, and the glow from the coals in the hearth became more pronounced, casting soft orange light across the floor and up the walls. This light was warm and gentle, not bright enough to banish the shadows, but enough to keep the room from falling into complete darkness. The travelers stood in this light, feeling its warmth on their face and hands, feeling the way it seemed to invite rest, to suggest that this was a place where rest was not only possible, but expected. The traveler moved toward the chairs, drawn by the thought of sitting, of letting the body rest even for a moment. The weariness in their legs had become more pronounced, a heaviness that made standing feel like effort, that made the simple act of remaining upright seem more difficult than it should be. They approached the largest chair first, the one with the high back and wide arms, and stood before it for a moment, looking down at its solid presence, its unmistakable weight. Lowering themselves into the chair required care. The seat was high enough that the traveler had to step up slightly to reach it, and when they finally settled into it, they felt immediately the wrongness of it. The seat was too broad. Their back did not reach the chair's back. Their arms could not rest comfortably on the wide arms. The wood was hard beneath them, unyielding, and though there was no pain in sitting there, there was also no comfort, no sense of the body being supported in the right way. The traveler sat for a long moment, trying to adjust, trying to find a position that might work, but the feeling of wrongness persisted, a gentle but insistent message that this was not the right place. With a soft exhalation, the traveler rose from the large chair, their muscles protesting slightly at the effort, and moved to the second chair. This chair was smaller, and when the traveler sat in it, the seat felt softer, more giving, as if cushions had been placed there long ago and had worn down over time into a shape that almost fit. The traveler leaned back, letting their weight sink into the chair, and for a moment it seemed as if this might be the right place to rest. But as they sat, small discomforts began to make themselves known. The back of the chair pressed against their shoulders at an odd angle, not painfully but noticeably, creating a pressure that would become uncomfortable if maintained for long. The arms, though better than the first chairs, were still too low, requiring the traveler to hold their elbows at an awkward position. And the seat, though softer, had a slight depression in the center that caused the traveler to sit in a way that felt unbalanced, as if they might slide to one side if they relaxed completely. The traveler sat for another moment, considering, weighing the discomfort against the effort of rising again, but in the end the wrongness was too much to ignore. They rose once more, slower this time, feeling the full weight of their weariness now, and turned toward the third chair. The third chair was smallest of all, and the traveler hesitated before sitting in it, wondering if it would hold their weight, wondering if it was even meant for someone of their size. But the weariness was strong now, stronger than doubt or hesitation, and the thought of standing any longer felt impossible. So they lowered themselves carefully onto the small seat, moving slowly, ready to catch themselves if the chair gave way beneath them. The chair gave a faint creak, a sound so soft it was barely audible above the gentle crackling of the dying fire, but it held. And as the traveler settled into it, something remarkable happened. The seat, though small, seemed to fit exactly right, the depth perfect for the length of the traveler's legs, neither too deep nor too shallow. The back of the chair curved in exactly the right way, supporting the traveler's spine at just the right points, neither pushing too hard nor failing to support at all. The arms, though narrow, were at precisely the right height, allowing the traveler's elbows to rest naturally, without strain or awkwardness. The traveler sat very still, almost afraid to move, afraid that any shift might break the spell of rightness that had settled over them. But as they remained still, they began to feel how completely the chair supported them, how perfectly it cradled their tired body, how it seemed to have been waiting all along for someone exactly their size, exactly their shape, to come and sit in it. The wood beneath them was smooth and warm, warmed perhaps by the fire, or by years of use, or by some quality of the wood itself, and this warmth seemed to seep into the traveler's body, easing the ache in their muscles, softening the hard edges of their weariness. The traveler closed their eyes for a moment, just a moment, and felt the temptation to simply remain here, to let sleep come while sitting in this perfect chair before the dying fire. But even as the thought formed, the body knew that sitting was not enough, that what was needed was not just rest, but the complete surrender of lying down, of stretching out fully, of letting go of even the small effort required to sit upright. The traveler's eyes opened again, slowly, and they looked around the dim room, searching for a place to lie down. Against one wall, partially hidden in shadow, a narrow staircase led upward into darkness. The traveler had not noticed it before, had been too focused on the chairs and the fire and the simple act of entering this warm space. But now it seemed obvious, inevitable even, that there would be stairs, that there would be rooms above, that this cottage would offer not just a place to sit, but a place to truly rest. The traveler rose from the small chair with reluctance, their body protesting the loss of that perfect fit, and moved toward the stairs. The stairs were steep and narrow, each step worn smooth in the center from years of feet climbing up and down, the wood darker where it had been touched most often. A railing ran along one side, rough and unpolished, offering support but requiring the traveler to grip it carefully to avoid splinters. The traveler placed one hand on this railing, feeling the texture of the wood beneath their palm, and began to climb, placing one foot on the first step, and bringing the other foot up to meet it, and moving to the next step in the same careful way. Each step creaked softly underfoot, a different note from each board, creating a quiet melody as the traveler climbed. The sounds were not loud or jarring, but gentle, almost musical, the kind of sounds that old houses make as they settle and breathe and accommodate the movements of those within them. The traveler listened to these sounds without thinking about them, letting them become part of the experience of climbing, part of the slow progress upward into the darkness above. The darkness itself was not complete. A faint light filtered up from the room below, the glow from the dying fire just enough to cast dim illumination on the lower steps, though the upper steps remained in shadow. The traveler's eyes had adjusted to the dimness by now, and they could see well enough to navigate the stairs without fear of missing a step or stumbling. The air grew slightly cooler as they climbed, the warmth from the fire below not reaching this high, and the traveler felt the change on their skin, a gentle cooling that was not unpleasant, but simply different. The climb seemed to take a long time, though in reality it was probably only a matter of moments. Each step required effort, the weariness in the traveler's legs making the simple act of lifting one foot and placing it higher than the other feel like a task that demanded full attention. But the traveler did not hurry, did not try to rush through the climb, simply moved at the pace the body dictated, one step at a time, breathing slowly and evenly, letting the rhythm of climbing match the rhythm of breathing. At the top of the stairs was a small landing, just wide enough for a person to stand and turn, and beyond it a low doorway that opened into another room. The doorway was so low that the traveler had to duck slightly to pass through it, bending at the waist and stepping carefully over the threshold. The act of ducking, of making themselves smaller to fit through the space, felt oddly right, as if the cottage itself was teaching them how to move within it, how to adapt to its proportions and its rhythms. Beyond the low doorway lay a bedroom, dim and quiet, with a single window set high in the wall. The last light of the day filtered through this window, a light so faint it was almost not light at all, more like the memory of light, the suggestion of it. This pale glow cast itself across the room in a way that illuminated nothing clearly, but made shapes visible, allowing the traveler to see the outlines of furniture, the positions of objects, without being able to discern fine details. The room was smaller than the one below, with a sloped ceiling that followed the line of the roof, lower on one side than the other. The walls were the same dark wood, unadorned and simple, and the floor was covered with a rug that had once been colorful, but had faded over time into muted shades of brown and gray. The rug was soft beneath the traveler's feet, softer than the wooden floors below, and walking on it made even less sound than walking on the stairs had made. 3 beds arranged themselves along the walls of the room, each one positioned with care, each one different from the others in size and shape. The traveler stood just inside the doorway for a moment, looking at these beds, feeling the pull of them, the promise they offered of rest and warmth and the complete release of the body into sleep. The weariness that had been building throughout the day, throughout the walk through the forest and the climb up the stairs, now felt almost overwhelming, a heaviness so complete that the traveler could barely imagine doing anything other than lying down. The first bed stood against the far wall, large and imposing, taking up a significant portion of the room. It was made with great care, the thick mattress covered with heavy quilts that had been piled one on top of another, creating a surface that looked deep and soft and inviting. The quilts were made of fabric that had once been vibrant, but had softened with age, and washing into gentler colors, blues and greens and browns that seemed to blend together in the dim light. The pillows were large and plump, stacked against the headboard in a way that suggested they had been arranged intentionally, with thought given to comfort and support. The traveler moved toward this first bed, drawn by its size and the promise of its softness, their feet making no sound on the soft rug. They reached the edge of the bed and paused for a moment, looking down at the quilts, noticing the way they had been tucked and smoothed, the care that had been taken in making the bed. Then, slowly, the traveler sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress give beneath their weight, feeling the softness of the quilts under their hands. The mattress was very soft, softer than the traveler had expected, and as they sat there they could feel themselves beginning to sink into it. It was not an unpleasant sensation at first, but as the travelers shifted their weight and prepared to lie back, they realized that the softness was too much, that the mattress was too deep. When they finally lay back, they felt as if they were sinking down and down with no bottom to catch them, as if the bed might swallow them entirely if they stayed too long. The traveler lay very still for a moment, trying to adjust to the feeling, trying to convince themselves that this was comfortable, that this was what they needed. But the sensation of sinking persisted, and with it came a vague sense of unease. Not fear exactly, but a feeling that this was not quite right, that this bed was not meant for them. After a moment, the traveler sat up again, the effort of pulling themselves free of the deep softness requiring more strength than they had expected, and they rose from the first bed and moved to the second. The second bed stood along another wall, smaller than the first, but still substantial, made with a similar attention to care, but with fewer quilts, a thinner mattress, a more modest arrangement of pillows. The traveler approached it slowly, their body already beginning to learn what to look for, what to feel for, in the search for the right place to rest. They sat down on the edge of this second bed and immediately noticed that the mattress felt different, firmer, more resistant than the first. The traveler lay back on this second bed, letting their full weight settle onto the mattress, and felt the firmness pressing back against their body. It was not painfully hard, not uncomfortable in any sharp or immediate way, but it was too firm, too unyielding. The mattress seemed to refuse to acknowledge the traveler's presence, holding itself rigid and unchanging, offering support, but no softness, no give, no sense of being cradled or held. The traveler lay still for a moment, trying different positions, turning slightly to one side, and then the other, adjusting the pillow beneath their head. But the firmness persisted, and with it the feeling that this bed, like the first, was not quite right, was not meant for them. The traveler shifted again, trying to find some small pocket of comfort, some position that might work. But after a time they accepted that this bed too was wrong, and they sat up once more and rose to their feet. The third bed stood in the corner of the room, beneath the high window. It was smallest of all, narrow and low to the ground, taking up very little space, almost modest in its presence. The mattress was thin compared to the others, and only a single quilt lay folded neatly at the foot of the bed, waiting to be pulled up and used. A single small pillow rested against the simple headboard, worn smooth by use but clean and carefully placed. The traveler approached this third bed slowly, almost reluctantly, not sure if it would be any better than the others, not sure if the pattern of wrongness that had established itself would continue, or if something might change. They stood beside the bed for a moment, looking down at it, noticing its simplicity, its lack of pretense. It did not promise luxury or overwhelming comfort, did not offer the deep softness of the first bed or even the firm support of the second. It simply was what it was, a small bed in a small cottage, waiting quietly for someone to use it. The traveler sat down on the edge of this third bed and immediately felt a difference. The mattress gave slightly beneath their weight, not too much, not sinking away into depths unknown, but just enough to accommodate the body, to acknowledge its presence. The traveler shifted, testing the feel of it, and found that the firmness was neither too soft nor too hard, but somewhere in between, a perfect balance that seemed to have been found not through calculation, but through long use and natural settling. Slowly, carefully, the traveler lay back on this smallest bed, letting their head rest on the small pillow, letting their body stretch out along the narrow mattress. And as they settled into it, something remarkable happened. The mattress seemed to shape itself to the traveler's body, supporting them in all the right places, neither pushing too hard nor failing to support at all. The pillow, small and worn, cradled the traveler's head perfectly, neither too high nor too low, neither too soft nor too firm. And when the traveler reached down and pulled the single quilt up over their shoulders, they found that it was exactly the right weight, heavy enough to feel comforting and secure, but not so heavy as to be oppressive or restricting. The traveler lay very still, feeling the way their body began to relax into the bed, feeling the tension that had been held in their muscles throughout the long day of walking beginning to release. The bed held them gently, firmly, perfectly, and for the first time since entering the cottage, the traveler felt that they had found the right place, the place where they were meant to be, the place where rest could finally come. The room around them was very quiet now, the faint sounds from outside muffled by the walls and the closed window. The traveler could hear only the soft rustle of leaves in the distance, the occasional creak of the house settling, and beneath it all their own breathing, which had already begun to slow and deepen. The light from the window was fading rapidly now, the last traces of day giving way to the deeper blue of early night, and the room was filling with shadows that seemed soft and unthreatening, simply the natural darkness of evening in a small, safe space. The traveler's eyes grew heavy, the lids beginning to droop, opening halfway and then closing a little further with each slow blink. They did not close their eyes all at once, did not force sleep to come, but simply let it approach in its own time, in its own way, the way sleep comes when the body is truly ready for it, when all resistance is faded, and there is nothing left to do but surrender. Their gaze drifted across the dim shapes of the room, unfocused and gentle, taking in the outlines of the other beds, the slope of the ceiling, the narrow doorway through which they had entered. These shapes seemed to soften and blur as the traveler looked at them, becoming less distinct, less solid, as if the room itself were beginning to dissolve into the approaching night and to the soft space between waking and sleep. Outside the window, though the traveler could not see them, the stars were beginning to appear, one by one, scattered across the darkening sky. The first stars were faint, barely visible against the last light of day, but as the sky deepened and the night took hold, they grew brighter, more numerous, until the sky was filled with them, small points of light in the vast darkness. The traveler could not see these stars, but they could sense them somehow, could feel the way the night was spreading itself over the forest and the clearing and the cottage, covering everything in its soft, dark blanket. The wind moved through the trees outside, a gentle wind that made no harsh or sudden sounds, but only whispered and sighed, carrying with it the scents of the forest, of pine and earth, and the cool dampness of evening. This wind was not strong enough to rattle the windows or stir the curtains, but it was there, a constant presence, a reminder that the world outside continued even as the world inside grew smaller and quieter and more still. The traveler's thoughts began to drift, becoming less like coherent thoughts and more like fragments, images, and sensations that rose and fell without connection or purpose. They thought of the path they had walked, the way it had wound through the forest, the way the light had changed from gold to blue. They thought of the chairs downstairs, each one different, each one wrong except for the smallest. They thought of the beds, the way each one had felt beneath them, too soft or too firm or just right. But these thoughts did not linger, did not demand attention or analysis. They simply passed through the traveler's mind like clouds drifting across a quiet sky. The weight of the traveler's body seemed to increase, pressing down into the mattress, becoming heavier and more solid with each passing moment. The quilt over their shoulders felt softer, warmer, as if it were wrapping itself more closely around them, and the pillow beneath their head seemed to shape itself more perfectly to the curve of their neck. The bed was holding them, cradling them, and the traveler felt themselves sinking not into the bed, but into the rest itself, into the deep, quiet space where the body could finally let go. Time passed, though the traveler could not have said how much. Minutes or hours, it made no difference. There was no clock ticking, no way to measure the passage of time except by the slow fading of light from the window and the gradual deepening of the shadows in the room. The night outside grew darker, and the stars grew brighter, and the wind continued its gentle song through the trees. And inside the small room beneath the window, the traveler lay still and quiet, their breathing so slow and even it was almost inaudible. The traveler's eyes closed at last, not in a single decisive moment, but gradually, opening less and less with each blink, until finally they simply did not open again. Behind these closed eyes there was only darkness, soft and complete, and the traveler drifted in this darkness without fear or concern, without thought or intention, simply floating in the warm, safe space that existed between waking and sleep. The cottage around them was silent now, all the small sounds of evening having faded into the deeper quiet of night. Downstairs the fire on the hearth had burned down to nothing, the last coals cooling and darkening, and the warmth that had filled the rooms was slowly seeping away, leaving behind a cooler air that was neither uncomfortable nor unwelcoming, simply the natural temperature of a house at night when no fire burns and no people move about. The 3 chairs before the hearth sat empty and still, waiting in the darkness. The 3 bowls on the table remained untouched, their contents long since gone, completely cold. The stairs that led upward were dark and quiet, showing no sign that anyone had climbed them, and the small landing at the top was empty and shadowed. But in the small bedroom beneath the window, in the smallest bed in the corner, the traveler lay sleeping, their body at rest, their mind empty and quiet. The bed held them gently, the quilt covered them warmly, and the pillow supported their head perfectly. Their face was peaceful, smooth, and relaxed in the way faces are when sleep is deep and untroubled, when dreams have not yet begun, and the mind rests in pure darkness. The traveler's breathing moved in and out, slow and rhythmic, a sound so soft it could barely be heard even in the complete silence of the room. Their chest rose and fell, in a pattern so steady and regular it seemed almost mechanical. But it was not mechanical. It was the natural rhythm of the body at rest, the body doing what it was meant to do, what it had been waiting all day to do. Outside, the night continued, deep and dark and unchanging. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, following their ancient paths across the sky, and the moon, hidden somewhere behind the cottage or beyond the trees, cast no light on the clearing or the forest. The world was dark and still, held in that deep hush that comes in the hours after midnight, when even the night creatures have settled, and the only sounds are the wind and the trees and the distant, barely audible movements of the earth itself. And in this darkness, in this stillness, there came a sound, very faint, very distant, so quiet it might have been imagined. Footsteps, soft and measured, moving along the path through the forest, the same path the traveler had walked hours before. These footsteps were not hurried, carried no sense of urgency or alarm, but moved with the steady, purposeful rhythm of someone who knew the way, who had walked this path many times before, who was simply returning home after a long day. The footsteps came closer, slowly, steadily, moving through the darkness with confidence, never hesitating, never pausing, except to navigate around a tree or over a root. They moved through the forest as the traveler had moved, one step at a time, but with more familiarity, with the ease of long practice. These were the footsteps of someone who belonged here, who was part of this place, who had every right to be walking this path in the darkness. After a time, the footsteps reached the edge of the clearing and paused there, just as the traveler had paused to look at the cottage in the twilight. But there was no twilight now, only darkness, and the cottage sat in this darkness like a darker shadow, barely visible against the trees behind it. The footsteps paused, and in the silence that followed, there might have been the sound of breathing, steady and calm, the breathing of someone who had walked far but was not out of breath, who had simply stopped to observe, to notice, to acknowledge the return. Then the footsteps began again, crossing the clearing, moving through the long grass toward the cottage. They made no more sound than the traveler's footsteps had made, perhaps even less, moving with a lightness that suggested familiarity with every stone and root and hollow in the ground. The footsteps approached the door, paused again, and then there was the soft creak of the door opening, the same sound it had made when the traveler had pushed it, but quieter, more controlled, the sound of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply to avoid making unnecessary noise. The footsteps entered the cottage, moving across the wooden floor with barely a sound, and paused again in the center of the main room. There was a long moment of stillness, as if whoever had entered was standing there in the darkness, looking around, noticing the chairs, the table, the cold hearth, taking in the state of things, understanding without words what had happened, what changes had occurred in their absence. The traveler, sleeping in the smallest bed upstairs, heard none of this, or if they heard it, it registered only as part of the dream they were beginning to dream, a dream that had no clear narrative or structure, but was made only of impressions and feelings, of safety and warmth, and the soft weight of sleep. The sounds from below, if they reached the traveler at all, became part of this dream, woven into its fabric so seamlessly that there was no distinction between the real sounds and the dream sounds, between what was happening and what was being imagined. The footsteps moved again, crossing the floor toward the stairs, and began to climb. Each step creaked softly, the same notes the traveler had heard when they climbed, but softer now, more careful, as if whoever was climbing wanted to make as little sound as possible. The footsteps climbed slowly, steadily, one step at a time, until they reached the small landing at the top. There was another pause, longer this time, as if whoever had climbed the stairs was standing at the top, looking toward the low doorway, considering, deciding. Then the footsteps moved again toward the doorway and stopped just outside it. In the darkness of the bedroom, nothing changed. The traveler continued to sleep, their breathing unchanged, their body still and relaxed beneath the quilt. The footsteps moved through the doorway, ducking slightly to fit through the low opening, just as the traveler had done, and entered the bedroom. They moved slowly, carefully, across the soft rug, past the first bed, past the second bed, and stopped beside the third bed, the smallest bed, where the traveler lay sleeping. There was a long moment of complete stillness, a moment in which nothing moved and no sound was made, a moment that seemed to stretch and expand, filling the room with its presence. In this moment, whoever had entered simply stood beside the bed, looking down at the traveler, seeing them there in the smallest bed, seeing the way they lay curled on their side with the quilt pulled up to their chin, seeing the peaceful expression on their face, the slow rise and fall of their breathing. And then, very softly, so softly it was almost not a sound at all, there came a sigh. It might have been satisfaction or resignation or simple tiredness or all of these things at once. It was the sound of someone who had returned home and found things not quite as they had left them, but who was too tired, too worn by their own long day, to feel anything more than a vague acceptance, a recognition that this was simply how things were, that this traveler sleeping in the smallest bed was part of the night now, part of the story of this house, and that there was nothing to be done about it that could not wait until morning. The footsteps moved away, retreating from the smallest bed, moving back across the room toward the doorway. They paused at the first bed, and there was the soft sound of someone sitting down, followed by the rustle of quilts being pulled back and then drawn up again. Then there was silence, complete and absolute, as if everyone and everything in the cottage had finally settled, had found their places, had accepted the arrangement that the night had made. The travelers slept on, unaware and undisturbed, held safely in the smallest bed beneath the window. Their breathing continued, slow and even, and their body remained still, deeply relaxed, completely at rest. The dream that had been forming around them grew softer, less distinct, fading into the pure darkness of deep sleep, where no images form and no thoughts intrude, where there is only the quiet, peaceful emptiness of the body at rest. Outside, the night deepened further, if such a thing was possible, the darkness becoming more complete, more absolute. The stars continued their slow wheel across the sky, and the wind continued its gentle song through the trees, and the forest held itself in that profound stillness that exists in the hours before dawn, when the night is at its deepest and the light is still far away, still only a promise on the distant horizon. Inside the cottage, in the small room beneath the window, two figures now lay sleeping, one in the largest bed and one in the smallest, both breathing slowly and evenly, both at rest after their long days. The middle bed remained empty, waiting, and the room was filled with the soft, peaceful silence of sleep, a silence so complete it seemed as if the whole world had paused, had drawn breath and held it, waiting for the morning that would eventually come, but that was still, for now, far away. The traveler's face remained peaceful and undisturbed, showing no sign of dreams or worries, no tension or concern. The smallest bed continued to hold them perfectly, the mattress supporting them just right, the pillow cradling their head, the quilt keeping them warm without being too heavy. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything had found its place, and in this finding and this settling, there was a rightness that needed no explanation, no justification, but simply was. And so the night continued, slow and quiet and unchanging, the stars turning overhead, the wind moving through the trees, the cottage standing in its clearing, and inside it, in the smallest room, in the smallest bed, the traveler sleeping, deeply, safely, peacefully, held in the soft embrace of rest, dreaming the formless dreams that come when the body is truly at peace, and the mind has let go of everything except the simple act of being, of breathing, of existing in this moment, this place, this small, perfect bed that had been waiting all along. The hours passed in silence, unmarked and unmeasured, each one the same as the one before, each one filled with the same deep darkness, the same profound quiet. The traveler's sleep did not change or lighten, did not move through the usual cycles of deeper and lighter sleep, but remained constant and heavy, a sleep so complete that nothing could disturb it, nothing could break through the thick blanket of rest that had wrapped itself around them. In this deep sleep there were no dreams, no images or stories that played out behind closed eyes. no fragments of memory or imagination that surfaced and demanded attention. There was only the darkness, soft and complete, and the traveler floating in this darkness like a leaf on still water, weightless and peaceful, held in a space where time did not exist, and nothing was required except the simple continuation of breathing, of being. The body rested completely, every muscle relaxed, every joint loose, every part of the traveler's physical self given over to the process of renewal and restoration that happens in deep sleep. The heart beat slowly and steadily, the lungs filled and emptied with perfect regularity. The blood moved through veins and arteries carrying oxygen and nutrients to every cell. And all of this happened without thought or awareness, the body doing what it knew how to do, what it had always known how to do, caring for itself in the way that only happens when consciousness has stepped aside and allowed the deeper processes to take over. The room around the sleeping traveler remained dark and quiet, the shadows unchanging, the air cool but not cold, perfectly still except for the barely perceptible movement caused by breathing. The window above the bed showed nothing but darkness, the glass reflecting nothing, revealing nothing, simply existing as a boundary between the inside and the outside, between the small safe space of the bedroom and the vast expanse of the night beyond. Outside, the clearing lay silent and empty, the long grass motionless in the absence of wind, the wildflowers closed and sleeping in their own way, waiting for the return of light and warmth. The forest beyond the clearing stood like a wall of darkness, each tree indistinguishable from the next, all of them merged into a single mass of shadow that seemed to go on forever, that seemed to have no end or edge, as if the forest were not just a collection of trees, but a thing unto itself, a presence, a being that existed in the darkness and was made of darkness, and would continue whether anyone was there to see it or not. The stars overhead continued their slow procession across the sky, moving in patterns that had been established long before any human had walked the earth, patterns that would continue long after all humans were gone. These stars were distant and cold, their light taking years to reach the earth, so that looking at them was like looking into the past, seeing things as they had been rather than as they were. But none of this mattered to the traveler, who could not see the stars, who was too deeply asleep to think about stars or time or distance, who existed only in the immediate present of sleep, in the timeless space where nothing existed except rest. The night wore on, and slowly, very slowly, so slowly that it would have been impossible to notice if one were watching, the darkness began to change. It did not grow lighter, not yet, but it began to thin slightly at the edges, to lose some of its absolute quality, as if somewhere far away, beyond the horizon, beyond the forest and the clearing and the cottage, something was beginning to shift. Some change was starting to happen that would eventually reach this place, but had not reached it yet. The traveler slept through this change, unaware of it, untouched by it. Their breathing remained slow and even, their body remained still and relaxed, their mind remained empty and quiet. The smallest bed continued to hold them perfectly, the mattress neither too soft nor too firm, the pillow neither too high nor too low, the quilt neither too heavy nor too light. Everything was exactly as it had been hours before, exactly as it needed to be, and there was no reason for anything to change, no reason for the traveler to wake or stir or even shift position. In the largest bed across the room, the other sleeper also continued to sleep, their breathing audible but soft, a counterpoint to the traveler's breathing, the two rhythms existing together in the quiet room without interfering with each other, without competing, simply coexisting the way two quiet sounds can coexist in a space without creating noise or disturbance. This other presence in the room had not disturbed the traveler's sleep when it arrived, and it did not disturb it now, simply existed alongside the traveler, sharing the space, sharing the night, both of them held in the same deep rest. The middle bed remained empty, waiting, its quilts smooth and undisturbed, its pillow positioned just so, as if it too was sleeping in its own way, resting, holding itself ready for whoever might need it next, but content to wait, to exist unused and unneeded for now, patient in the way that objects can be patient, simply being what they are without complaint or desire. The darkness outside began to thin a little more, the process so gradual that it seemed less like a change and more like a slow revelation, as if the darkness were slowly becoming transparent, allowing something behind it to show through, something that was not yet light, but was no longer complete darkness either. The stars overhead began to fade, not disappearing all at once, but growing dimmer, losing their brightness, as if they were being erased slowly, gently, without force or suddenness. The travelers slept on, their sleep as deep and unbroken as it had been all night, showing no signs of lightening or ending, no signs of the approach of morning. Their face remained peaceful and still, their eyes closed, their mouth relaxed, their whole body loose and heavy with sleep. The quilt over their shoulders rose and fell with each breath, a movement so slight it was barely visible, and beneath the quilt, the traveler's body maintained its position, curled on one side, knees slightly drawn up, arms tucked close, the position of someone deeply at rest, deeply safe, deeply at peace. The air in the room had grown cooler during the night, the last warmth from the fire below having long since dissipated. But this coolness was not uncomfortable, was not enough to disturb sleep or cause discomfort. It was simply the temperature of a house at night in a forest, cool but not cold, fresh but not harsh, the kind of temperature that makes quilts welcome and beds warm by comparison, that makes sleep feel like a refuge, a shelter from the world outside. Time continued its slow movement forward, though there was still no way to measure it, no clock to consult, no change obvious enough to mark the passing of minutes or hours. The night simply continued, holding itself in that space between full dark and the first hint of dawn, that space that seems to last forever, that seems to be its own kind of time, separate from the time of day or the time of evening, a time that exists only in the deepest part of night, when the world is most quiet and most still. The traveler's sleep remained unchanged, deep and dreamless, a sleep so complete that it seemed less like sleep and more like a different state of being entirely, a state in which the body rested so completely that it was almost as if the traveler had ceased to exist as a separate entity and had instead merged with the bed, with the room, with the cottage itself, becoming part of the stillness, part of the quiet, part of the darkness that filled every corner and every space. And in this mergence, in this becoming still, there was a quality of peace so profound that it seemed to extend beyond the traveler, beyond the room, to fill the entire cottage, the entire clearing, perhaps even the entire forest. It was as if the traveler's deep rest had created a field of peace around them, a space in which nothing could be hurried or troubled, a space in which time moved differently, or perhaps did not move at all, a space in which everything simply was, without need for change or progression or movement toward any goal or purpose. The darkness outside continued its slow transformation, the thinning continuing, the absolute black giving way to something slightly less absolute, a darkness that was beginning to show gradations, to reveal different depths of shadow, though still no light had appeared, still no hint of color or brightness had entered the world. It was as if the night were slowly backing away, slowly releasing its hold, but doing so with such reluctance, such gradualness, that it seemed it might never fully let go, might continue this slow retreat forever without ever actually ending. The traveler remained asleep, held in that deep place below dreams, below thoughts, below any kind of awareness except the most basic awareness of existence, of breathing, of being. The bed held them, as it had held them all night, perfectly and completely, and the room surrounded them with its quiet protection, and the cottage stood solid around the room, and the forest stood around the cottage, and the night stood around everything, layers of safety and stillness, each one contained within the next, each one adding to the profound sense of peace that filled this place, this moment, this endless now in which the traveler slept. The approaching day moved closer, imperceptibly, inevitably, but it moved so slowly that it seemed it might never arrive, that the night might last forever, that this moment of perfect rest and perfect stillness might continue on without end, that the traveler might sleep forever in the smallest bed beneath the window, held in the soft embrace of the quilt, cradled by the perfect mattress, supported by the perfect pillow, surrounded by the perfect quiet existing in the perfect darkness, breathing the perfect air, being perfectly at rest in this perfect place where everything was exactly as it should be, where nothing needed to change, where nothing would change, where time itself seemed to have paused and decided to wait, to stay here in this moment and this night in this deep and beautiful stillness that asked for nothing and gave everything and simply was.